Welcome everyone to this new Greytalk. This is the first one after the summer break, and we are delighted to have with us Paul Ladd, Director of UNRISD, and Kari Tapiola, who will be commenting. The title of today's Greytalk is really exciting. It's the new eco-social contract. The 20th century social contract is broken. Where to next? And as if they say, if it's not broken, why fix it? But if this is broken, how do we can fix it? So for those who don't know Paul Ladd or Kari Tapiola, and just for the record, I will present some information about them. Paul Ladd has been director of UNRISD since October 2015. Previously, he led UNDP's policy team on inclusive globalization, including trade, development, finance, and migration. He provided support to the Office of the UN Secretary General on the financial and economic crisis and engagement with the G20, and he was director of the team supporting consultations, technical inputs for the 2030 development agenda. Paul was a policy advisor on international development to the UK Treasury, including the period building up to and through the UK's chair of the G8 and European Union in 2005. Previously, he had been chief economist and acting head of policy with the UK charity Christian Aid, the UK Department for International Development's economic advisor for South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland, and a financial advisor in the Central Bank of Guyana. Paul received his Bachelor of Science in Economics and his master's degree in Quantitative Development Economics from the University of Warwick. And in 2016, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in law, also by the University of Warwick. Paul is a member of the International Geneva Committee of the Swiss Network for International Studies and the UNITAR 2030 Advisory Council. Paul is also an International Geneva Gender Chaplain. Thank you very much for having accepted to be with us in this great talk. And a few words about Kari Tapiola. He is one of the most known and respected former officials, high officials of the ILO. And he has a very, very long curriculum vitae. He was born in Finland, and he has been a journalist, foreign news editor, secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Helsinki, International Secretary of the Central Organization of the Finnish Trade Unions in Helsinki, Special Assistant to the Executive Director of the United Nations Center of Transnational Corporations in New York, General Secretary of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to OECD in Paris, Communication Directors of SAK Finland, International Affairs Director of SAK Finland, and this is where I met him as my boss, Deputy Director General and Executive Director of the Standards and Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work of the International Labour Organization in Geneva. From 2010 to 2014, he has been a special advisor to the Director General of the ILO in the Central Project, and he has been a non-practitioner retired since then. Thank you very much for both of you for accepting to be in this great talk. So now, Manuela, would you please explain to us how we will proceed? Thank you.
Yes, so we will proceed with questions and comments after the presentations and the interaction between Paul and Kari. Please feel free to write your comments or questions in the chat. I will moderate the debate. And I would like to give immediately the floor to Paul with the general comments. My first reaction when I read your report is that I had the impression it was written with a sort of anger, with a sort of rebellion, saying that everything is wrong and really we have a lot of homework to fix our current systems on several fronts: environmental, social policies, economic policies, and so on. So please share with us your maybe anger, rebellion, I don't know how to call it. Go ahead, Paul, please.
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Alejandro. It's always a pleasure to join Greytalk's event, so thank you very much for inviting me to talk. Thank you also to Kari for being here to give some perhaps sage, less angry comments on what I'll talk about. Just a couple of words about UNRISD for those of you that don't know us. The acronym stands for the UN Research Institute for Social Development, based in Geneva here in the Palais des Nations, established in 1963. And we are a research institute that focuses on the contemporary dimensions of social development issues. We're autonomous, and that practically means two things. Firstly, that we don't draw down on any resources from the main UN budget. So we go out and mobilize the money that we need to do our work each year. And secondly, we don't have member states, governments on our board or in our governance structure at all. And that has typically lent us the freedom and space to be progressive and also occasionally angry. So that is, I think, where I'll start. The talk that I wanted to give draws on two background documents. The first is an UNRISD issue brief from last year, which is called A New Eco-Social Contract, Vital to Deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the second is our forthcoming flagship report, which will be launching fully next month on October the 21st. And that's called Crises of Inequality, Shifting Power for a New Eco-Social Contract. And UNRISD's current research strategy is focused entirely around reducing inequalities. We have research programs on transformative social policy, on gender justice and development, on alternative economies for transformation, and on climate and environmental justice. And we have an office in Bonn that focuses on research impact and uptake. But the work that we do on reducing inequalities is framed with this broader vision about helping communities around the world rebuild or shift their social contracts, with a term that we've given as ecological social contracts or eco-social contracts. So the problem statement will, I think, unfortunately be familiar to you all, and that is a world experiencing a number of sequential or sometimes overlapping crises. We have, I think, at the top of the list, the destruction of our climate and natural environment, with humanity living beyond its natural resource means and exceeding a number of planetary boundaries. And within that, we've got poorer countries and poorer people bearing the disproportionate impacts of extreme weather events and the disproportionate costs of adaptation, when in large part they've not been responsible for the consumption, pollution, or damage that has been caused by other countries. We have a series of health pandemics, most recently COVID-19, caused in large part by our unhealthy relationship with nature, leading to a number of zoonotic diseases of different scales in different regions. And we've seen, associated with COVID-19, huge vaccine inequity in the world, and even the impacts of lockdowns and on unemployment were much stronger in low and middle income countries. We have deeply entrenched economic inequalities where wealth is being sucked out at the top, and those with few assets are living increasingly precarious lives, leading to a situation where in the past 3 decades, the top 1% has captured nearly 20 times the amount of wealth as the bottom 50%, where 1% of the world's adults owns nearly half the world's total wealth. And those economic inequalities contributing periodically to economic and financial crises, to societal breakdown, to disillusionment with politics and trust in government institutions, in the UN, in other formal institutions, and arguably also to pressures on migration. We have social, group-based, what Francis Stewart calls horizontal inequalities, where we've made a lot of progress in advancing rights and inclusion in recent decades, but where we're also now seeing a backlash against women's rights, a backlash against gender equality, and even the recognition of gender diversity more broadly. And foremost in our mind, we have a set of global tensions and conflicts, some old, some new, in Ukraine, but also in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in Syria, ultimately causing for regular people wanting to get on with their lives, destruction, death and displacement, but also food insecurity, energy insecurity, and increased poverty in many other parts of the world. And the argument that we make is that inequalities in their different dimensions is a factor that runs through all of these crises. It's a common theme. Inequalities that drive crises and shocks, crises then playing out within existing patterns of inequality, and typically, in almost all cases, then exacerbating those patterns of inequality. We saw in COVID where the 10 richest men doubled their fortunes, while the income of 99% of the world's population fell. And these inequalities are also playing out in the context of other big tectonic global shifts related to demography, aging, urbanization, and rapid technological change, which can reduce inequalities if they're governed properly, but sometimes, perhaps often, are not. And there's a strong sense, recognized by many of our academic partners, that the social contract as we knew it is breaking down, or has unraveled, or is more broken in some places than others, but is certainly not serving the purpose that it was meant to serve. And you see this recognized by the UN Secretary General in his report, Our Common Agenda. You see it recognized by many governments. You also see it recognized by business and the World Economic Forum. There's a recognition that this thing we call the social contract, in all of its forms, in all of its diversity in different parts of the world, has unraveled very quickly, and in many parts of the world has broken down. That is the old social contract. The old social contract, I'll come back to that, is ignoring, perhaps was never even fit to address, the issue of environmental destruction and the environmental precipice we face. And the social contract is not promoting or supporting social justice. It hasn't adapted to our globalized world or the recognition of human diversity and human rights for all people in our societies. So before I move on to what we delineate as some of the building blocks of new eco-social contracts, let me just clarify what I mean by these old social contracts. Because of course it depends where you come from to a certain degree. In Europe and North America in particular, the old social contract is or was understood as a more equal relation between labour and capital, where productivity-led growth would provide the resources to provide social protection and public services for all people, therefore making everybody better off in a more equal way. But this started to unravel in the late 1970s and early 1980s with a move to a more efficiency-driven capital-first capitalism, what some people would call a neoliberal agenda, where redundancies in the system were ironed out for the sake of efficiency, but ultimately undermined resilience and undermined the protection and advancement of workers' rights. And we've seen the stagnation of real wages in Europe and North America since the middle of the 1980s. Beyond the social contract associated with Western welfare capitalism, different types of social contracts can be found in different parts of the world. For example, the concept of Ubuntu in Southern Africa. But even these more communitarian contracts, which build on local capacities, local agency, local culture, were often undermined by the seepage of this more efficient neoliberal agenda, including in structural adjustment programs that we saw with the World Bank and IMF in the 1980s. And while some of the local structures, practices, and institutions still exist, the formal public institutions and structures often do not. So turning to ecological social contracts or eco-social contracts, this is a term that's been used by UNRISD since 2015, 2016, when we developed and launched our last flagship report. And it certainly isn't UNRISD's job to prescribe what these new eco-social contracts look like. And in fact, from our Bonn office in Germany, we've launched a global eco-social contract research and action network, which has campaigners, activists, representatives from indigenous communities who contribute to a much richer and diverse debate on how societies are constructing these eco-social contracts themselves. And there is some hope, I think some hope that we've identified in running that network, because people are all over the world fighting for environmental justice and social justice, and increasingly doing that at the same time. And they're putting together in different sectors, on different issues, in different geographies, the jigsaw pieces of what you could conceive of as new ecological social contracts, new norms and expectations between societies and those in government. So I said it's not UNRISD's job to prescribe, but through that work and through research, we've identified 7 broad characteristics that would help us to identify whether these social contracts being negotiated or formed are eco-social, whether they respond to demands for economic, environmental and social justice. And I'll go through those 7 now. And the first is human rights for all, including for those excluded or relegated from previous social contracts. So to give the obvious example, in the golden age of capitalism, when social contracts oversaw a huge expansion in people's well-being and a huge period of growth, women's participation in the labour force was much lower. And societies were much less diverse because they had not incorporated, much of the waves of immigration into Europe, the UK, for example, that we've seen since. So there are people, there are groups that are not as well reflected in our understanding of social contracts than they should be. So the first is human rights for all, and a recognition of all people's roles in all parts of the economy and society. The second is a progressive fiscal contract. And that is one that raises sufficient resources for climate action and the implementation of the goals and targets we've set out in the SDGs, but also at the same time more fairly distributes the burden. We're seeing in the UK at the moment a return to a previously dismissed concept of trickle-down economics, but it's actually the opposite. It's going to be trickle-up economics in the UK from now on. And there's clear there is not a progressive fiscal contract in the UK. And I think when people realise that the caps on bankers' bonuses are being lifted, they will get angry because they're struggling. They're struggling with food prices because of global instability, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the sort of growth burst after COVID. So we need progressive new fiscal contracts. Third is the transformation of economies, mostly. To halt climate and environmental destruction, we need a sort of a new paradigm around how we incentivize and govern and sometimes regulate economic activity. And the example I'd give here is the work that many of us, including UNRISD, do on social and solidarity economy, where you have entities that are much more based around the principles of sustainability, either socially or environmentally, and therefore embrace the circular economy, recycling, reusing products and services, but in a way that limits or reduces our impact on the resources available to us globally, which at some point are going to reach a crunch point because of population, because of its demands, and because of the limits of many of the resources that we have. So we actually really need to think about how we actually understand our economies, what we value within our economies, how we measure progress, and whether that's based around GDP or GMP, or rather about well-being and how we're serving people in different parts of the world. At the same time, of course, recognizing that there are many parts of the world which have a huge aspiration to catch up and to consume and to be on an equal pegging with the development they've seen in the global north. Fourth is a contract with nature, because I think fundamentally humans have considered themselves sort of floating above the global ecosystem and not as a part of it. And that creates huge problems because we see ourselves as extractors, packagers and sellers, rather than this intrinsic part of nature, which we have to respect and grow with and recognize the limits of. So a contract with nature needs to protect essential ecological processes. It needs to support life systems and the diversity of all life forms, some of which we don't really know very much about yet. And we're destroying potentially future assets at a huge rate in a completely unregulated and silly way. Fifth is a contract that addresses historical injustices. So new eco-social contracts should be informed by local and indigenous knowledge in all parts of the world, by social values and capacities from the global south. And if possible, they should remedy historical injustices and support just transitions in places which were not the cause of climate change or environmental destruction. Six is a contract for gender justice, in which the activities of production and reproduction are more equally shared by women and men, and where care work in particular, which is capitalism's blind spot, is structured into societies so that we have free choice and participation in the labour market, and where care work is chosen to be done, that it's properly valued and fairly remunerated. And the seventh is really new forms of solidarity that inform governments through more diverse and democratic processes at the national level, but also promote a renewed and rebalanced multilateralism, which I think is largely failing at the moment. So the flagship report that we launch next month concludes with a chapter on policy reforms that would support the consolidation or the creation of new eco-social contracts. I'm just going to reflect on a few of those, just to leave enough time for Kari and also questions, but they cover all the things that you'll be familiar with, but just haven't been politically achieved yet. So universal social policies, stronger labour market and employment policies, including minimum and living wages, possibly even looking at the ratio of CEO pay to median worker pay, work-life balance policies, fiscal policy, so progressive national systems, but also making much faster progress on international tax avoidance and erosion, and putting in place progressive fiscal systems at the international level. So reigniting the discussion that we've had in the past few decades on financial transaction taxes and taking the gambling out of our financial system. Fourth, on business and market regulation. And regulation is a tool that is just not being used to its full potential at the moment. I mean, if we recognize that we have a carbon budget and we can't keep on pulling fossil fuels out of the ground, then why are we not regulating against the exploration of new fossil fuel fields under the sea in vulnerable parts of the world? This is a complete absence of leadership and responsibility, and a place where regulation could really step in. Socially sustainable environmental policies, and what we mean by that is, of course, you can nudge behaviors through the fiscal system and through sin taxes, but it has to be done in a way where you have public buy-in, where poorer people in society are not being forced to take on, if you like, an unfair share of the burden of shifting away from unsustainable practices. So we saw in France, of course, a rejection of positive environmental policies because they were socially unfair. So we have to make sure that the progressive environmental policies we're putting in place are also socially sustainable. Urban policies on housing, transport that's green, food systems, looking again at sovereignty and security issues in the context of breakdowns at the global level, but also food processing and regulating against over-processing of food, which is leading to a huge crisis in obesity and diabetes. Policies around gender equality, pay, care, anti-discrimination, but also anti-discrimination policies and affirmative action for other groups which have been excluded or discriminated against. And then lastly, at the global level, global governance reforms, global redistribution. So not just the financial transaction tax I mentioned, but also new ways of conceiving about solidarity at the international level. So you may have come across the concept of global public investment, GPI, to replace aid, which is paternalistic and top-down and often driven by the donors. The idea that you put money into a pot according to your ability to pay, and when you need to take money out, then you take out what you need. Shifting to a more respectful, balanced, global idea of solidarity and financial support at times of stress would be a huge advance on our current aid system. So I've been talking, I think, for about 22 minutes, so I thought I should stop there. And hopefully that's enough of a taster that you might want to pick up our flagship report when it's launched on the 21st of October, and also look on our website for the issue brief on ecological social contracts.
Thank you very much for this. Was really a very good appetizer to the content of the forthcoming report. So, Kari, you have the floor now. I'm pretty sure that you have plenty of comments and reflections on what was just said. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really do have a lot of reflections, and they're going in all directions. But what I would say is it's of course difficult or even impossible to disagree with Paul. You know, I think he could have stressed even more that the system as we have it now, the multilateral system, which should produce the answers to these questions, simply does not function. Many parts of it function quite well. I think COVID has shown that, and many crises have shown that you can get cooperation going. You can involve several agencies, you can involve stakeholders, you can involve different kinds of groups. But then when you come to the level where you should really get some change, where you really should be able to get some decisions done, you don't get very far. Actually, this is where we are blocked, and I'm rather worried that we are reliving, we're living again the problem that sank the League of Nations. Now, generally, there's a feeling that the League of Nations was a failure, and I would argue that it certainly was not. We just have not understood that what did not function was the political level, broke down there. But at a technical level and, well, technical, say, more professional level, like with labor, the ILO, or with the activities that developed into the WHO and after the Second World War, into FAO and UNESCO and others. So those functioned, but it's the overall level that does not function. The other thing that comes, I think, very well across is that we really do have all the answers. I was thinking at the time of COVID that is there something new that we should find and try to apply to deal with the situation. You know, I happened on something that the ILO had published about 17 years earlier, which was the lessons of the SARS epidemic, and a kind of guide on how to deal with a pandemic of that kind. And it was all there. If you look at the health and safety standards, if you look at the working environment standards, if you look at the employment standards, whether you have a health crisis or an employment crisis, you actually have the solutions. What we haven't really come down to is how do we implement them? What is the follow-up? And if we talk about a renewed social contract, then I think it's useful to not only talk about what that should cover and why it is important. As a matter of fact, I think it should be obvious why it is important. The question is, how do you get there? What should you do? The very specific nature of the ILO, in a way, is that if you look at the original constitution from 1919 of the ILO, which launched the notion or expanded on the notion of social justice, that is very short on substance. It is actually very technical. It's a question of how you, negotiate what would amount to a social contract between those groups that have legitimate opposing interests. And you recognize that they're going to continue to have those opposing interests, but then you find you need to negotiate what you want to do with it. You put that down in a standard, and then you have a follow-up. You have promotion, you have supervision, you have different rules. The original idea of some of those who were drafting the Constitution in 1919 was that the rules for labor would become binding rules for the whole world immediately after their approval. And that was not so. They have to be translated into policies at the national level. And then you need to have some kind of a system which brings the constituents together, not only governments. There's no way you can leave it to governments. In the case of labor, it's trade unions and employers. Ever since the UN was set up, we've had a growing been giving growing importance to NGOs, to civil society organizations. This is where you kind of find constituencies that can get and that you need to empower to get involved and become partners in a negotiation. I think one of the problems that we have with questions of climate, I don't easily find the answer to the question, what is the climate constituency? And how could one empower it? What would be the possibility of negotiating something which would not remain just pious wishes and good intentions, but which really could turn into standards and decisions which would be followed up and implemented in an efficient way. There's no simple solution to that, but what I'm saying is that unless we address the question not only of having a new social contract, but how do we implement it? So then we are in trouble. I mean, in the ILO, we have experience on how to implement conventions. And we have been gathering more and more experience on how to also implement them in case of countries which have not taken the legal obligations, but which can be, say, through different ways got into understanding that it is in their own interest and in general interest, in everybody's interest, to follow that, to follow those policies. I mean, we have been able to do that with, let's say, classical labor issues. Now, as Paul said, there are new groups. There are groups which, say, like an organization like the ILO did not deal with when it was set up. But the recent trend in new standards is towards expanding the reach, towards actually saying that these standards concern everyone, irrespective of their status. I think the Convention Against Violence and Harassment at Work from 3 years ago, that was a good example of something which concerned everyone. And fundamental rights, freedom of association, non-discrimination, or prohibition of forced labor and child labor, they concern everybody. So there are ways of doing that. But I'd also note that there are ways of not doing that. And in terms of, I think the ILO should also understand that we need to have some self-criticism in situations where we have had great unanimity, great agreement on what should be done. A case in point is the Global Jobs Pact of 2009, which was unanimously approved by the International Labour Conference, and it has virtually all the good things that should happen in order to maintain employment. But there was no follow-up. There was no follow-up system. The only follow-ups that we had were secretariat missions to different countries, trying to encourage them to apply the Global Jobs Pact. And basically they were met with the observation that, look, we decide ourselves, and we don't need the ILO Secretariat to come and tell us what should be done. So I'll finish with that. One of the big challenges that we have is, how do we get over this, let's say, assumption, or not even assumption, but it's more like general policy, that you do not accept in practice the legitimacy of international agreements. Because we keep on developing the international consensus on what is wrong. But then if we cannot find a way to get somehow work done on how to correct it, we will continue talking at a level of abstraction while things are falling apart. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Kari. I think Paul has some food on his plate now to reply, to react to these comments and questions. Paul, would you like to do so now? Or?
I'm also very willing to save as much time as possible so other people can chip in. But I think, let me just, 30 seconds just on the how, because I find this question really interesting. And it's interesting when you split it down on different issues. So Kari asks, who's the constituency to stop environmental destruction? And unfortunately, some of that constituency are not alive yet. So you don't really have a political constituency to stop environmental damage in the year 2120 yet, because these people don't exist. And so we have that sort of fracture. But I'm also interested in the national contestation processes where people who are less well off are persuaded to vote for policies that are utterly against them. And it's difficult to understand whether it's on social protection systems, i.e. more expensive welfare systems, which would in turn support more inclusive and fairly distributed growth, or whether it's on strong national health systems, which also would keep people in employment, which would provide healthier workforces. This understanding of strong social policy and economic policy going hand in hand seems to have broken down, and I don't quite understand. And I'm interested in this sort of new world of information that we're existing in, where debates can be dominated by untruths, by those with more power to put untruths into the public domain. So I think this issue of contestation, of fact, of what could actually promote public policies which are in the interest of more people is absolutely key, because we've known what is for many years, and we've seen it working in some societies. One last point. Kumi Naidu, who is the ex-head of Greenpeace, the ex-head of Amnesty International, he works with us on ecological social contracts. And last week, he reminded us that if you want to win these debates going forward, if you look at how we've approached climate, it's all facts, it's evidence, it's logic, it's cold, it's dry, and we're not touching people's hearts and minds in the same way. We're not using arts and culture and drama and all of these other things that most people then would have a different entry point and would allow them to have a much greater resonance and understanding of the issues. I think we're technically and technocratically trying to win some of these arguments, when we actually need to use other campaigning techniques, other activism techniques to get people mobilized.
Thank you, Paul. I will first convey to you a question that was sent on my WhatsApp just minutes ago by David Dror, and then I will give the floor to Cecile, I think, and whoever would like to jump in. But let me read David Dror, who's a former ILO staff member. He has three issues here to both of you, to both Paul and Kari. The first one is, what basis is there to assume that the Western norm of attempting to reduce inequalities is globally relevant? Is this not a contextual value that may apply differently or to varying degrees in different societies? This is the first issue. The second one concerns the informal sector, and particularly the issue of expanding social protection to the informal sector. that not enough was done and is done to address that sort of inequality that is very specific but very important one. Thus is the problem of inequality not one of the absence of brave leadership to break barriers, but rather probably another sort of problem of inequality that has to be addressed with other means. And finally, the third issue is that when the Western world faces vital challenges to rules that supposedly enjoy unanimity, notably respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries, is the world not returning to a breakdown in the rule of law? And when there is such a breakdown of the rule of law, does not inequality seem the lesser evil? Should the attention not be focused on avoiding the mass killing of civilians before we seek perfection in redistributing assets and resources? Well, this is for another 2 or 3 great talks, I think, each one of these issues, but I don't know. This is the challenge, and try to maybe to react as you want. Please, Kari or Paul, I don't know.
I'm just wondering if we should also listen to Cecile first and then sort of wrap them together.
Yes, thank you very much. I am struck, Paul, as I was listening to you, by the many common threads between the work that UNRISD is doing and the work that UNDP has been doing in the last 3 Human Development Reports. The questions that you raised and also that Kari raised, they all point in the same direction. And I get a sense that a number of think tanks and of leading experts and organizations are reflecting on the dangers and the threats that humanity is confronted with now. And I don't see much synergy between those different threads of thought. And I'm wondering to what extent all of that work can or hopefully will contribute to the Summit for the Future that the Secretary General is planning to hold now in 2024. It was planned initially for 2023. Do you see any possibility of using that particular event where world leaders, decision makers are supposed to congregate and reflect on what needs to be done? Do you see any opportunity, any possibility of actually reaching out to them and convincing them that to go along the recommendations that you have outlined and that I also have read in other similar reports? Thanks.
Paul, would you like to react to that?
You know, there really is not enough time to do justice to David's 3 questions, I would say. There really isn't. And I may paraphrase them and therefore not do them justice in that way. But I mean, the first question I think is around possibly different norms and values in different parts of the world, which may be more sensitive or less sensitive to inequality or not. I think that's a relevant question. It's the right question to ask, and it's one that's particularly on our mind when we do our work, our convening work, our collecting work, our research work on social contracts, because this idea of what we understand the social contract is very driven and has philosophical underpinnings, in the 18th century in Europe and North America, and is not mirrored in other parts of the world. So it's fair to ask the question on, is inequality important to the same extent in different places? I would point to some of the work in behavioural economics at the moment, Andrew Oswald at Warwick and others, that show that when you actually ask people about bargains, what they get out of a deal with other people, generally across the board, people don't like unfairness. They don't like to see that other people are doing much, much better than them, particularly if they feel that those other people have less talent or are putting in less work. And we're living at the moment in a world where we are seeing rapid growth and catch up in some large economies, particularly in the global south, which is obviously really good because it's reducing poverty. But at the same time, with communication technologies and phones and iPads, many people are aspiring to an unsustainable lifestyle of excessive conspicuous consumption. And that inequality is harming societal development, and it's harming, I think I would argue, global cooperation as well. So I suspect, although can't say definitively, that inequality probably matters to most people around the world, because people generally don't like to feel that they're being shafted by other people with less talent or who are putting in less effort. And I think a really important question is the third one also. With the world in such turmoil and in conflict, is focusing on inequality even important at all? And I think it is. And I think actually the argument is that inequalities have become a barrier to progressive change that would prevent crises and shocks. I think it's easier to make the argument on climate and in some other areas and health because of the translation of economic power of elites into political power leads to discourses and political capture that then entrenches policies that are unsustainable or non-redistributive. Essentially, elites with their growing power are a barrier now to progressive change. And I think various groups are recognizing that. It's less easy to connect to the idea of the type of conflict we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think that has different roots, different background. But on all the other issues, I think we find in our report that inequality actually now is important, not just because we're seeking an ideal, fair, balanced sort of world society, but actually now it's reached the extent that it's preventing the possibility of shifting to a more progressive set of policies. And then just quickly on Cecile's, now all of these groups and all of these think tanks and all of these reports and HDR, we're all sort of linked periodically, and we touch base every now and again, and I think we cross-fertilize. I mean, that was the point of setting up this eco-social contract network as well, to not assume, if you like, leadership in it, to have a very flat structure where we could learn from others. And I do suspect when it comes to feeding inputs into the preparation for the World Social Summit, as will be, I think inequalities, both horizontal and vertical, are going to be a huge issue, much more so than, you know, winding the clock back to Copenhagen in '95. So I think there is a lot of space, because I've already been talking not just with academic groups or research groups, but also leadership groups like the Club de Madrid, the elders and others, and they're already preparing their preparation processes to feed into, you know, the World Social Summit. And I suspect that inequalities and the extent of inequalities in the world at the moment is going to get much higher profile than it did in previous processes.
Thank you, Paul. Just as a footnote, don't worry too much about the time, because this is not a TV show. We do not have a specific time to close. If needed, we can go ahead for a few minutes. As far as there are questions or comments, we are the owners of our own time. So, Kari, I don't know if you want to elaborate on these questions that were raised so far?
Yes, I would really want to. To David's questions, I think the first one touched on the way of how to apply rules differently in different societies. Well, I'd just say, as long as we understand and agree on the rules, so then we should apply them differently and apply them in the way in which those societies are most ready to accept them. Of course, within certain limits, but we need much more understanding about how that process works. I don't think there's been absence of leadership in the informal economy. Without some quite remarkable leaders, we would not understand it as much and as well as we do today. But of course, empowering the informal economy without addressing the problem of why it is, I mean, what is the problem of informality is very, very difficult. We know that we cannot just say, no, everything should be just made formal, but then how to improve the situation with certain features of the informal economy staying on and persisting, that is again something that you need to look at from one case to another. As to the breakdown in the rule of law, I think it's obvious that there are serious breakdowns in whole understanding of what the rule of law means. Cecile said there doesn't seem to be synergy between the different threads. Yes, well, I think the problem is, and this leads me to think about the social summit, the 30 plus, I mean 30 years after Copenhagen, which will be coming up. If we do everything at the same time, we don't get very much done. And the problem that I see is that we are doing all possible things. And then when we try to draw conclusions of what should be our action, everyone wants to have their own view in it. The social summit in Copenhagen, 1995, it produced a very voluminous document. The document actually was not approved by the summit because it was ready only quite some time after the summit. In that voluminous document, many, many pages, there are 2 sentences of fundamental workers' rights, or fundamental rights at work. On the basis of those 2 sentences, in the ILO, we developed the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and a follow-up process for that. And the question is, how do we make sure that we not only cover everything, because if we cover everything, we may have a problem of prioritizing anything there. Would it be at all feasible if a summit could come out with 1 or 2 pages instead of 120 pages of analysis and recommendations, and say that, look, this is the absolute priority. Let's all get down to work on that. I'm taking one example from the ILO. When we started seriously doing some standards work on the issue of child labor, so the convention that we came out with in 1999, 90 years after the ILO had been founded, and child labor is already, or getting rid of child labor was already in the original constitution. But at that stage, we worked out a consensus that, all right, all child labor should be got rid of, but some forms are so bad that they cannot wait for all the different remedial action. They have to be tackled immediately. And then they were called the worst forms of child labor. This is the only international labor standard, and as far as I know, the only international convention which has been ratified by each and every member state of the organization. We have universal ratification around a document which was built on the idea of that you need to prioritize. You need to understand what to do first and where to try to do that. Now, on what Paul said, inequality, yeah, well, I would say inequality is a question of power. And the maintenance of inequality is the question of maintaining the power relationships that we have. Elites certainly are a barrier to change. Anyone with a vested interest who's afraid of losing it will not want to lose it. And if we want to have more equality, so we cannot have the kind of inequality that we have. Now, if revolution is not a solution, so then the alternative solution is trying to negotiate and find a way for those concerned to be able to agree on which steps to take and which steps to take first. And of course, one looks at the state of the world, so no sane person would design the world as it is anyway.
Thank you, Kari. I have Gabrielle and then John Burley with questions or comments. Gabrielle, please.
Just very quickly, because I do think we're running out of time and concentration, but
oops, something happened to Gabrielle.
We're running
Well,
out.
let's move to John then. The meanwhile, John,
yeah,
you had a comment, yes?
I'm having problems with the iMac this afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to be very direct and a bit brutal, so please excuse me for this. But I'm afraid I'm in the situation where I don't understand how a system that is failing or has failed or doesn't function as it is intended to do can be expected to reform itself. And if you could help me on this, it would be appreciated. Now, I'm not suggesting a revival of communism, let alone Marxism. I'm not suggesting, although how desirable it might be, for a system of benevolent dictators. But if, as Paul has very ably demonstrated, the capitalist system is not functioning as it should be, and the democratic system of periodic elections doesn't function as it should do, all of the issues and difficulties that have been discussed this afternoon are certainly not short-term. They are anything if medium and long-term, for which, of course, the traditional Western democratic system is particularly ill-equipped to deal with. So can someone please reassure me that the only way out of the situation we're in now is not a complete destruction of the world and a complete re-beginning from the ashes of what had been left behind? Thank you.
Thank you, John. I don't know if there are quick answers to that. I don't think so, but the floor is open. In the meanwhile, Gabrielle sent me a message. She wanted to highlight that the UN Convention on Rights of the Child also was universally ratified, with one exception, which is the United States. I want to take advantage of these minutes to support John's comment. I was thinking about the same, the feasibility of all the policy recommendations and reforms that are flagged in the report, which are absolutely correct, but feasibility, particularly without progressive political leaders, which is the term used in the report, that we simply do not have around the world, and particularly in Europe these days. I think, Gabrielle, I raised your question on the convention. I don't know if you have another comment.
Yeah, my comment was a different one. I thank you so much for this really important conversation. I was hoping to ask Paul, you said that it's only the future generation that will be claiming justice on climate. But I mean, we have so many young people and older people as well right now, you know, around the COP processes of the UNFCCC, making actually quite radical claims now about even calling it reparations, you know, this making up, compensating for past damage. So I was just not clear about your comment that it would require future generations to make those changes happen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Do you want to react to this specific comment?
If I may, just a couple of minutes on both, really. I mean, I think John's question is really, really interesting. How can you expect, as Nick Cave once sang, people just ain't no good. So how are you going to reform, you know, these things which they've naturally led us towards? But I think I would say periodically you have stronger moments of reflection, and I think we've been lacking those recently. I think most of us were expecting, after the global economic and financial crisis in 2008, 2009, possibly after COVID, we would have had a much stronger, more entrenched, reflective process to work out what was going on. And that hasn't happened. People wanted to get back to business as usual. And that's worrying, I think. But if you look back at periods of sort of market-driven growth, in an era when there was abundance, that delivered vast leaps in human progress and art and culture and well-being. But I think it's more a problem with this very stretched, extractive, rentier, neoliberal economics that we've seen become more dominant in the last 40 years, that has coincided with a period of growing inequalities, that has coincided with very short-termism across the board, including on corporate reports and government life terms and all the other policies that they're trying to put in place. So sometimes it's hard to remain optimistic about whether we can shift back onto a more sustainable setting, but I don't think everything needs to be thrown out. And I think we will hit natural sort of breakpoints when we run out of things. I mean, there was a discussion on degrowth, which is difficult at the moment because I don't think it lands politically well, because people don't like to think they're going to be worse off. But we need to have a proper debate on a post-growth global economy that recognizes that 10 billion people can't keep up using resources at the same extent that they're using up. And that will force a paradigm shift. And I think that will force some changes in economic structure back towards circular economy, back towards recycling, to using less, to accepting a lower growth rate, to accepting a growth rate perhaps that we saw before the Industrial Revolution, so maybe 1% a year, which slowly creeps up progress. So I do think it will happen. It's hard to see how it will, but I think it will happen eventually. Democracy, I'm completely aghast at and adrift at the moment, because I think the main concern is that how people have realized that they can abuse large amounts of information that they're capturing online to steer people towards the things that they want them to do. And I think this is deeply worrying in our polities at the moment. Unless you really regulate how much information is collected, how it can be used to stop its abuse, then I think our democracies are at risk of polarizing further over the next several decades. And that is not going to support us getting back onto track on sustainability. A very quick clarification on Gabrielle's question. It wasn't that, you know, there aren't people doing their best, including young people and coalitions with older persons across the board for radical policies on climate change. It's just that this mismatch between the impacts now and the impacts in the future, and a lot of the constituency, it's like the tip of the iceberg, will exist in the future. If they were here now, showing us the lands that we've left them, then I'm sure they would be very, very vocal about it. But we've just got that timing consistency problem with public pressure, with voting systems. Everything is just too short term at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. Before giving the floor to Alejandro to conclude, just one suggestion to Paul, if I may. Oh, Kari, I'm sorry, Kari.
Yeah, I just wanted to chip in if you still have the patience. I mean, how to reform a failed system. Many people have tried. Gorbachev tried that, and we've seen what that led into. I suppose it was Churchill who said that democracy is the worst system, except all the other alternatives. Generally, think the rule, at least if we look at the ILO experience, the rule has been that no progress really takes place unless the alternative is sufficiently threatening. Now, at this moment, if the alternative is, say, the world kind of burning up or disappearing or becoming unlivable, the question is, why is this not understood? Looks like no amount of information is going through. And I feel, with the next generations, my grandchildren looking at the debate on the environment, so they keep on asking, what the heck are you doing to us? And I think that that is a really justified question.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to Alejandro to close this debate, I have a suggestion to Paul for his work, insofar as I may suggest something in a very practical way, talking about rules at the global level that need to be implemented. The ILO was mentioned several times this afternoon for very good reasons, but I would suggest also to look at the WTO and the IMF and World Bank that have real, very tough teeth, as we call them, at the global level to ensure the implementation of their rules. So maybe some lessons also should be drawn from that experience, because when there is political will to make an international institutions implementing its own rules, if the political will is there, the effectiveness is there too. So maybe, Paul, you would like also to think about that and to put that into the picture at the multilateral level, I mean, of course, in terms of global governance. Alejandro, over to you for the conclusion.
Thank you very much, Manuela. And really, thank you very much, Paul and Kari. Can you hear me? Well, this was really a very fascinating, great talk. You touched every point that I had prepared before hearing you. And I realized that we are in a very difficult situation, and it can get worse. And this is something that was not mentioned. If we don't act and we don't solve it, as time goes by, this is going to be more difficult and more challenging in many ways. So Kari spoke about the revolution, but I'm afraid that if we don't act and if we don't have results, we don't have any magic solution, as John was asking for. But instead of revolution, we're going to have an involution there is just 3 points that I had Mark, did you already touch on them? And one is, if we are expecting to have results that by its own nature, they're going to take place in the long term, we need to have some continuity in the contract. And how to ensure continuity is something that just Paul touched. When you have a democracy system that is working and that you have governments that change side every 5 or 6 years in every country, how to ensure this kind of continuity. And also there is a question about will. We spoke about the needs, but indeed, solidarity, social protection, social contract, still to me, I believe it's a tough sell. It's really very difficult to sell. There are very powerful people and institutions that are really willing to stay in the status quo. And finally, there's also the perception, which is linked to the previous one. There's a perception that this is something from the past, that this is not an evolution, that is an evolution, and anything that has the word social, it's just like a populist propaganda. So I would just really, as Manuela mentioned in the introduction, this really opens our appetite to see your flagship report in October, Paul. So really, thank you very much. We're really looking forward to it. And thank you very much, Paul and Kari. This was really a fascinating, great talk. Thank you to all the participants, and I'm looking forward to see you all in the next great talk that will take place on October 18th. Thank you so much to all of you, and take care, stay safe. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.